Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They told me they couldn't help me with my medical bills, and for a while I tried to convince myself that maybe they really couldn't. Maybe times were hard and they were just being practical, but deep down I already knew the truth. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my family, it's that practicality only applies when it comes to me. I remember sitting in the doctor's office that morning, the words circling in my head like a swarm of angry bees I couldn't swat away. We'll need to schedule the procedure soon. It's not optional. My hands shook as I typed in the estimate into my notes app, staring at a number so absurdly high that it felt more like a joke than a bill for my own body. It wasn't some elective thing. It wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't me being dramatic. It was my health, my life, and the price tag set there on the screen like a threat. When I finally gathered the courage to call my parents, I didn't want to beg, but there's something about hearing your own mother say, "Honey, we just don't have the money right now," that makes you feel like you've been stripped down to the bone. I could almost see her face in my mind as she spoke, sympathetic enough to sound concerned, but detached enough to make it clear that she considered my crisis just another minor inconvenience in her day. My dad chimed in with that classic line of his, "You've got to be responsible. You can't expect us to bail you out every time life throws something at you," and I swear I almost laughed, because when, exactly, had they ever bailed me out? I wasn't the one they pulled strings for when tuition came due. I wasn't the one who got the "don't worry, we'll take care of it" treatment when cars broke down or rent checks bounced. That was always Matthew. And here I was, not asking for some frivolous bailout, but for help breathing easier at night without wondering if I'd keel over from something entirely preventable. The worst part wasn't the refusal itself, it was the way they wrapped it in false morality, as if their tight fists around their wallets were a sign of parental wisdom instead of plain favoritism. I remember the silence that followed, my phone pressed against my ear, the sound of their voices already gone but their words buzzing in the empty air. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the chipped laminate, thinking how cruel it is that in this country you can have a job, you can do things mostly right, and still be one hospital visit away from financial ruin. And to have your own parents shrug at that reality, as if you were asking them to fund a trip to Vegas, that's a wound that doesn't scab over quickly. I pieced together what I could. I drained my small savings account, maxed out one credit card, and started calling clinics, trying to figure out payment plans that didn't make me want to throw up just looking at them. Nights were the worst. I'd sit awake staring at the ceiling fan, feeling like a stone was pressing into my chest, thinking maybe I should have kept my mouth shut and just dealt with it quietly, because humiliation piled on top of fear is its own kind of sickness. But then the calls started trickling in from my mom. Not to ask how I was feeling, not to check on whether I'd managed to schedule anything, but the casual kind of calls where she rambled about new curtains or what she and Dad were planning for summer. One night, I picked up and tried to keep my voice steady, but something in her tone stuck out to me. She said, almost absent-mindedly, "We're just trying to be smart right now, you know, putting aside money for something important for Matthew." My hand froze around the phone. Important for Matthew. Those words stuck in my throat like a shard of glass. She kept talking, completely unaware, her voice light, almost giddy, but all I could hear was the echo of that earlier refusal layered over this new admission. No money for me. No money for medical bills that could literally determine whether I walked through life healthy or broken, but apparently plenty set aside for him. That night I sat in silence long after the call ended, the glow of the street lamp outside bleeding through the blinds, my chest tight with a mix of rage and shame. I wanted to scream, to drive over there and demand to know why, to hold up the stack of papers from the clinic and ask if they'd feel the same watching me collapse on their doorstep. But instead, I listened. I listened the next day too, when she spoke on the phone to someone else and her voice carried just enough for me to catch the edge of her brag. "We're saving for something special for him. He deserves it after everything." I stood there frozen in my own kitchen, hands damp, my heart sinking lower than I thought possible, because suddenly everything snapped into focus. It wasn't that they couldn't help me. It was that they wouldn't. And that difference changes everything. The announcement came the way big news always travels in my family, not as a private conversation where people look each other in the eye and weigh the cost of words, but as a messy explosion inside the group chat where my mother types with too many exclamation points and my father sends blurry photos of receipts like they are war medals, and Matthew, of course, drops a perfectly staged selfie with a lake sparkling behind him and a caption that read like a college brochure for a life I was never invited to audition for, because there it was in a cascade of photos and voice notes and triumphant little paragraphs about blessings and hard work and family goals, the keys glinting on his open palm, the cedar deck gleaming in fresh sunlight, the little blue kayak pulled up on pale sand, the shot of my parents holding champagne flutes on a porch that had never existed for me in any universe where fairness was a thing people cared about, and if I am sounding bitter it is because I was. And also, because the math was suddenly so easy that even my aching brain could solve it. They had money for this dream by the water. They had money for lake breezes and wood smoke and a guest room that would sit empty 9 months of the year. But when the bill with my name on it needed to be paid, their wallets developed a sudden allergy to oxygen. I stared at the photos longer than was healthy, counting cabinet doors like that might make them disappear. And for a second I felt like a kid again standing in the kitchen after dinner while the good dessert plates went to Matthew's friends because they were big athletes and had worked so hard, and I was told to be supportive and not make everything about me. Which is a funny line to say to a daughter who is climbing out of medical debt one overdraft fee at a time, but I guess irony is a family tradition right up there with pretending not to notice favoritism when it is dressed in a nice sweater, and maybe that is why I bit my tongue until I tasted metal and typed something mild, something like, congrats, because I knew better than to feed the beast with a full confession of what seeing those photos did to my stomach. The phone started ringing almost immediately because happiness in our house was always a performance, and you had to clap on cue or people would accuse you of hating theater, so my mother's voice came in bright and brittle, the way a crystal glass sounds when it is about to crack, and she said I should come up for a long weekend once the weather settled, said I would love the way the stars looked over the treeline, said I could swim in the mornings and help her choose curtains in the afternoons. And she even added, like a carrot held just out of reach, that I could reset up there, as if the word debt could evaporate like mist if I just breathed enough pine air. And I listened because I am polite and because a part of me still wanted the old fantasy of being taken care of without asking twice. But another part of me, the part with the hospital wristband still in a kitchen drawer, was making a quiet list of every time that generosity had skipped me like a stone across a lake. Matthew followed with a voice memo about local breweries and winter skiing and the neighbors who seemed chill, and I caught the smirk in his tone even though he tried to bury it under fake brotherly enthusiasm. That little curl of satisfaction that comes from winning a game you were the only one allowed to practice for, and when he said, "You can recover up here, sis, fresh air is good medicine," I actually had to set the phone down and walk to the sink. Because there is only so much condescension a body can metabolize in one afternoon without becoming poisoned by it. What surprised me, and maybe this is the part that hurt most, was how quickly the story hardened into a legend that the relatives repeated without blinking, the version where my parents had worked and saved and sacrificed, and were finally rewarding the son who carried the weight of the family by being the successful one, while I, according to the subtext polite people use like cologne, was the daughter with feelings who should be happy with the role of cheerleader, and if I needed help with something as trivial as my blood and bones, perhaps I should first adjust my attitude and clap louder when the hero enters the room, but I did not say that out loud because I knew the script. And instead I did something small that tasted like a victory and did not require an audience to understand it. I scrolled through those photos again, not because I wanted to punish myself, but because a different kind of clarity had begun to arrive, a practical mood that felt like cleaning a drawer, and I saved the shots that mattered. The porch number visible in the corner of a selfie, the address scribbled on a gift tag tied to the keys in my father's hand, the realty sign reflected in the glass of the front door, and I filed them away with the kind of discipline people say I lack. Because I realized that the truth has a way of ripening when kept cool, and that my family, for all their public declarations about privacy and loyalty, had chosen to live their triumphs very loudly. Which meant they had also accidentally handed me the material to make a different noise if I ever needed to. I did not blast anyone online or call in a favor to torch their reputations, because I am not a wrecking ball and I still recognize that cruelty sticks to the hands that swing it, but I did sit down with a cup of tea and write a crisp, relentlessly polite email to the Homeowners Association, whose contact address was conveniently listed on a sign in one of the photos. An email full of sunshine about how delighted I was that my parents had purchased a seasonal home in such a conscientious community, how thrilled I was about rules that preserved the quiet, how grateful I felt that the association worked closely with county assessors to keep improvements and tax records accurate and public, and I signed it with my mother's full name and phone number. Not as a forged threat, but as a tiny mirror held up to their pride, because if they wanted to live inside the story of being careful stewards of a lakeside investment, then it seemed only fair that careful stewardship would come knocking in the form of dues, inspections, and those cheerful newsletters that never stop arriving once you are on the list. When I hit send, I did not feel vindicated or mean. I felt awake, and I tucked my little act of housekeeping back into the quiet place inside me where I store the things that keep me from exploding at family dinners. Then I silenced the group chat for a week and got on with the unglamorous work of paying another installment to the clinic. But just as I was closing my laptop, a message slid down my screen from an aunt who never calls me unless something is already on fire, asking if I had heard the rumor going around about how my parents had tightened the budget to help me and might need to postpone some lake plans because of unexpected medical needs, and I stared at that sentence for a long breath, realizing the legend was already rewriting me into a debt they had nobly chosen to shoulder, which is when I decided that my next reply would not be a gentle correction, but something sharper. And the call I made after that set in motion a conversation my parents could not control. Silence has a way of becoming its own kind of language, and after that announcement, after the photos and the champagne and the rehearsed speeches about family pride, I decided I would let my silence do the heavy lifting. Because no argument I could make would be sharper than simply removing my applause from their theater. Days passed, and then weeks, without me chiming into the group chat or calling back, and at first it felt good, almost cleansing, to step back and watch their celebration play out without my forced participation. But then the phone calls started multiplying. My mother leaving voicemails that danced around the question of my health while pretending the real wound between us was just some misunderstanding. My father's messages shorter and sterner, accusing me of being disrespectful of letting my feelings get in the way of family unity, as though the problem wasn't the very deliberate choice they had made, but rather my refusal to swallow it quietly. Meanwhile, Matthews seemed to revel in my silence, filling it with little digs disguised as jokes, the kind that arrive in text form with a laughing emoji, but sting anyway because the intention is clear. Don't be jealous, sis, some people just catch more breaks. His words landed like little sparks on dry grass, and though I refused to respond, I saved each one, because I knew that in families like ours, evidence always becomes useful eventually. But in the space where their voices faded, I began to hear something else, my own. For the first time in years, I wasn't explaining myself, wasn't begging to be understood, wasn't defending why my needs were valid. I was just quiet. And in that quiet I started hustling, stringing together odd jobs, tutoring, writing freelance copy, selling off furniture I didn't need, anything to keep the next installment of my medical debt from drowning me. There was a kind of grim humor in it, and I leaned into that, because when you find yourself listing handmade crafts online at 2 in the morning while your parents sip wine on a new porch by the lake, the only options are to laugh or to break. And I had already done enough breaking. I told myself jokes about how I was the unofficial queen of side hustles, how maybe I should start a podcast called Ways to Pay Your Doctor Without a Family Safety Net, and though nobody else laughed, it gave me a kind of fuel. The irony of working double shifts just to survive while my family rebranded themselves as Lakeside Royalty wasn't lost on me, and every time I mailed another payment to the clinic, I thought of it less as a bill and more as a receipt for independence. A reminder that I was building something they could never take credit for. But avoidance has its limits, and eventually the confrontation arrived in the form of a phone call I couldn't dodge. My mother's voice was sharper this time, tinged with desperation that almost sounded like guilt, but never quite crossed the line. "Why are you cutting us out of your life?" she asked, as though the answer wasn't already plastered across every photograph of Matthew holding those house keys, as though she truly couldn't connect the dots between "we don't have money for you" and "look at what we bought for him." I didn't answer immediately, because part of me wanted to scream, to lay out every receipt, every screenshot, every night spent calculating whether groceries or a bill would win that week. Instead, I let the silence hang long enough that she started filling it with excuses, talking about how life is complicated, how sometimes parents have to make hard choices, how she wished I wouldn't hold a grudge. And in that moment, listening to her try to rewrite the story as if it were a chapter from some noble parenting handbook, I felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't rage either. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for people to hand you what they've already made clear they will never give. I realized then that my revenge wouldn't come in fiery speeches or door-slamming scenes, but in something quieter, something smarter, something they wouldn't see coming until it was already done. Because if they wanted to act confused about why I was cutting them off, then maybe it was time to give them a lesson in what true confusion feels like. And as I hung up, smiling in a way that probably would have terrified them had they seen it, I opened the folder on my computer where every screenshot, every photo, and every smug little text sat waiting like cards in a deck, ready to be played. I did not march into their living room or post a manifesto online or throw a match at the powder keg they had so carefully stacked, because spectacle has always been their preferred battlefield, and I am done letting them choose the terrain. So instead I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of reheated coffee and a folder of receipts, screenshots, and clipped phrases, and I built a quieter kind of storm, the sort that looks like a change in barometric pressure until the roof is all ready. Rattling, because if they were going to claim confusion about why I had stepped away, then I would give them clarity without a single raised voice, just the clean lines of their own words arranged like mirrors around them so there was nowhere left to look but inward. The first move was almost boring in its politeness, and that was the point, because when you are accused of being dramatic, the most elegant revenge is to be meticulous. So I wrote a short letter addressed to the handful of relatives who had been circulating the story about my parents tightening their belts to help me, a letter without adjectives or wounded metaphors, just dates, totals, and the exact language my mother had used when she told me they could not assist, followed by the photo of Matthew holding keys on a porch with a view that could pay the salary of a resident nurse in a heartbeat, and I closed by saying that while I appreciated everyone's concern, I wanted the record to be accurate so that moving forward nobody should feel obligated to speak on my behalf or on my parents' behalf without the facts, which landed like a plate of raw vegetables at a barbecue, because nobody wants the truth when the rumor tastes better, but it did the job, and within days the temperature of the group chat shifted from glowing to awkward as a broken lamp. The second move was less gentle, though still technically polite, because I have learned that power in families like mine lives in the spaces where money and reputation touch, which is why I took those beaming photos and that address reflected in the glass and fed them into a neat little packet that I mailed to the church finance committee that has always loved my parents' public generosity, along with a note that said I hoped they would include my parents on the visiting roster for congregants. With new homes, since the lake property would surely benefit from a house blessing and perhaps a volunteer day to help install the ramp my father had promised for my grandmother when she came to stay, a ramp that did not exist anywhere but in his speeches. And while that might sound petty, I assure you it was strategic, because if you have ever watched a church bulletin quietly pin someone to their own promises, you know it has a gravity that is hard to wriggle out of without bruising the ego. The third move was administrative, which is another way of saying it was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, and it involved a tidy email to the county office asking, in the cheeriest tone I could muster, whether there were public records available for the recent improvements on a certain parcel by the lake, since my elderly aunt was considering a similar screened porch and wanted to understand the permitting process and tax implications, which invited a flurry of courteous replies that included words like assessment and compliance and inspection windows, and when a follow-up request from the association reminded my parents to register the new gas fireplace insert and pay a seasonal fee, I could practically hear my father's teeth grind through the thin walls of my apartment, which I will admit gave me more satisfaction than therapy had all year. Still, the point was not to punish them for sport, but to move the story back closer to the truth. So the fourth move was the one that cost me something, because I hate asking for help even when I deserve it. And I hate exposing my own soft spots to an audience that might prefer a cleaner heroine, but I sent a carefully worded message to the handful of people who had genuinely checked on me, not the ones who loved gossip, but the ones who had showed up with soup. And I told them I was okay and on a payment plan and piecing together a life that did not rely on promises that had already been broken. And I included a notarized copy of the form removing my parents as my emergency contacts and replacing them with a friend who had earned that title the hard way, because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it without the safety theater of two people who would arrive to the hospital with a lecture about budgeting. And because revenge is sweetest when it looks like housekeeping, I ended the week by scheduling a cheerful listing alert on every real estate platform for that tiny shorefront town, which meant that anyone who had ever searched for my parents' last name would now receive periodic updates about comparable sales and tax changes, a drip of reality that would keep the porch lights of accountability flickering even when I slept. And I slept very well that night, not because I had hurt anyone but because I had finally protected myself with the only armor that works in families like mine, boundaries that bite a little when ignored. It did not take long for the phone to begin humming like a hornet trapped in a jar. First my father with a voice like a slammed door telling me I had crossed a line, then my mother crying in that way that sounds like theater to anyone who has ever lived backstage, insisting that I had embarrassed them in front of people who mattered and asking why I would want to ruin something that brought our family joy. And I told her, slowly and clearly, that I had not ruined anything, I had simply returned each piece of the story to its rightful owner and let the audience read the program. Then I ended the call before she could switch to the part where she calls me ungrateful. And I stood very still in my kitchen while the evening light turned the countertop the color of old honey, wondering if maybe I had finally gone too far, wondering if this was the moment the audience would decide I had become cold. And then my phone buzzed again with a new message, not from my parents this time, but from a number I did not recognize, a short line that made my mouth go dry. We need to talk about the education account from years ago, before someone else does, which was the first crack in a door I did not even know existed and the reason I sat down hard. Because apparently the house by the lake was not the only family structure built on a foundation I had never been invited to inspect. When the message about the education account arrived, it felt like the ground beneath everything I thought I had already exposed suddenly cracked wider. Because I realized that my parents had not only chosen Matthew over me in this very public chapter of the vacation home, but had probably been structuring the entire story of our family finances around him for decades, while dangling scraps of morality in front of me like consolation prizes. I sat staring at that line, "We need to talk about the education account from years ago," until my hands went numb, because the words themselves were short, but the shadows they cast were enormous, and in that moment I understood that my silence, my absence, and even my carefully sharpened revenge had only scratched the surface of something much larger and uglier. I did not call back immediately, because I wanted to control the pace for once, and instead I went digging through old files, boxes I had shoved into closets, envelopes with brittle glue, anything that might confirm what my instincts already whispered. And slowly a picture formed, not clean but jagged, showing me that my parents had once opened accounts for both children, accounts that had supposedly been funded over the years, though only one of those children had ever actually seen the benefit, because Matthew's tuition, his first car, and now his house had been written in ink, while my share had been written in pencil and quietly erased. By the time I pieced enough together to see the pattern clearly, the outrage that had once burned in me like fire had cooled into something heavier, almost metallic. Because this was no longer just about one medical bill or one refusal, but about an entire philosophy of parenthood that had been edited and narrated to make me believe my needs were excessive while his were investments. When my mother finally did call again, her voice was soft, the kind of soft that is meant to make you think you are hearing care when what you are really hearing is fear. And she said they wished we could move past all this unpleasantness, that families sometimes make choices that seem unfair in the moment, but even out later, and she tried to assure me that if I just stayed close, everything would eventually balance. I let her speak, because sometimes the most cutting response is to give someone the stage they are desperate to control and then refuse to applaud, and when she asked directly why I had become so distant, why I would rather lean on strangers than my own blood, I finally told her the only truth that matters, that I had not cut them off out of anger but out of survival, because it is impossible to keep bleeding yourself dry for people who never intended to keep you alive in the first place. I did not shout it. I did not curse. I simply laid it out as calmly as a signed document, and the silence that followed told me she knew it was not a performance she could rewrite. My father eventually stormed onto the line, blustering about betrayal and dignity and how I had embarrassed them, and I listened until he ran out of steam. Then I hung up. Not out of cruelty, but because some conversations have no destination except exhaustion. That night I blocked their numbers, archived the group chat, and sat at my small desk staring at the folder of evidence I had once collected like ammunition. I thought about burning it, about closing the chapter forever, but something in me resisted, because closure is not always about destroying the past. Sometimes it is about keeping the record intact so you never let someone gaslight you back into the role they prefer. In the weeks that followed, I found myself breathing easier, the way a room feels after a window has been opened to let out smoke, and though people still called occasionally to ask what had really happened, I learned to answer in a single sentence. They wouldn't help me with my medical bills, but bought my brother a vacation home. That sentence was enough, because it carried all the weight without requiring me to dress it up. I could see in their eyes or hear in their silence whether they understood, and that was all I needed. My revenge was not in humiliating my parents or dismantling their lives. It was in refusing to play my part in their version of family anymore, in building a world where my worth was not measured against the square footage of someone else's porch. And now, when they ask why I have cut them off, I no longer feel the sting of guilt or the temptation to justify myself, because the truth is simple and indelible. I do not hate them. I am not even sure I want them to suffer. But I finally know what love is not, and I cannot keep standing at the edge of a housewarming party, hoping for a chair at a table that was never built for me. Maybe one day they will see it. Maybe one day they will call not to demand or to rewrite, but to acknowledge. But until then I am content to let the silence answer for me. Because sometimes silence is the only language left when words have been used as weapons for too long.